an ignorant Christian emperor who thought that all you need is the Bible and shut all the Greek stuff down. Well, I don't agree with that. You know, I'm a hermetic philosopher. I am a Christian, but I'm also a believer in the ancient Greek wisdom. I mean, it would be a catastrophe for humanity if all that, you know, had been torched. I mean, at least we've still got Plato and Aristotle and Plutarch and all the great Cicero and all the great intellectuals of Greek and Roman history and so on, Herodotus. You know, that's how we really know about any of this stuff. And it was kept alive by learned monks here in Europe, a few of them in cold old Britannia. Bede was a particularly clever man who loved scholarship, you know, and kept alive the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans. The oracle was shut down, but the wisdom lived on. And what we're saying now is that it's time to revive the games. They were set up again in 1994. They're headquartered in Germany, in Berlin, and they've been taking place. I want to give them a bigger boost and really up the public knowledge of the games. And I want thousands of the world's greatest poets, painters, artists, sculptors, theatre people, dramatists, dancers, to go and compete, you know, in the games. I mean, they're held every 4 years, can be in different countries, but there'll always be a little, you know, flame burning in Delphi and periodic games taking place there. So we've had a meeting of the Delphic Academy this last week, which I'm involved with, and it's very exciting. I just want to share just one little thing about that, because in my research I've been doing some work on Plutarch. Now Plutarch he's one of those figures that if you're into classics, you know, you've heard of and probably read a bit of. I think he's been underestimated, his importance. He lived in sort of after Christ. He lived in the time when the first, Christian period. It's not clear whether he knew about Christianity. He never really mentions it in his writings. It was a very small, marginal movement. He was born in 47 AD. We know that when he was fairly young, probably in his 20s, he went to Alexandria. He was born in the part of Greece near Delphi called Chronologies. And he went to Alexandria, he studied there, which had the amazing library. He was from an intellectual background. And he later wrote a book on the treaty of, on the history of Isis and Osiris. Obviously, when he was in Alexandria, he interviewed priests of Isis and Osiris, Egyptians. He was interested in what we call the Hermetic mysteries. And that is one of the most important sources for what the religion of Isis and Osiris actually consisted in. And since I'm a member of the Fellowship of Isis, among many other hats, and I have many friends who are fellow Isians, I mean, read the treatise of Plutarch on the religion of Isis and Osiris, because it's still a really important source text. He has Osiris going off to India and teaching agriculture and the arts of civilization. And then when he comes back, he's clobbered by Seth and put in the coffin and killed and all that. So that's obvious that Plutarch was on the side of peace. Right, so then the other thing Plutarch wrote, of course, was the parallel lives, because he was also someone who'd gone to Rome. He went to Rome probably in 77 AD. He visited, and he had friends, and he was shown around. He then went back in 92 AD, and this time he was quite famous, and he gave public lectures, and a lot of Roman intellectuals turned out and met him, because he'd written by then the Parallel Lives, which was a bit of a bestseller in the ancient world. And it's easy to see why, because it's what it is, for those of you that don't know, he was a Greek, he was a patriot, he loved Greek history and philosophy. By then he'd become a priest at Delphi, and he at one point became the master of the games, the Delphic Games for that year. So it was down to him to organise the whole thing, which he did. So he was a lover of Greece, but he also knew the Romans were quite intelligent too and had their own cultural traditions and their own sages and their own wisdom people. And he explored parts of Italy, went up to the north, and he had friends among the Roman intelligentsia who showed him round. And as a result of that, he then wrote this masterpiece, which is called Parallel Lives, which is a very good idea. And he has one Greek, and then he finds a Roman that's equivalent to him. And so, you know, part of the fun is like, which one does he pair with which? So, for instance, he has Lycurgus, who was the statesman that founded the laws of Sparta, who was greatly loved by everyone that's into law and, you know, ancient Greece and all that. He says of Lycurgus that he travelled to Crete, he went to Asia, he was studying how laws were governed, what polities were well-mannered and well-behaved. He says Plutarch says he went into Egypt. He went maybe as far as Spain, Africa and the Indies. And he has conferences with gymnosophists, who are the Jains or Hindu fakirs of the day. Anyway, you know, it's lovely. And then who does he find to match with Lycurgus? Well, he finds one of my favourite Romans called Numa Pompilius. Numa was the founder of Roman religion, and he was a Sabine. He was the second king of Rome, and he is a historical figure, and he was asked to become king of Rome. You know, he didn't sort of look for the job, and he said, "I'll only accept that job if you give me a free hand." Okay, come and do it. So he introduced religion to the Romans, by which he meant the rituals and rites and ceremonies and festivals and the calendar. He introduced the Roman calendar, and he started the first temple building. He made sure that the Romans became a pious people, because in his view, piety, reverence and respect for the gods, is the key to righteousness. If we lose all faith in the gods, all belief of any kind, and think we can do anything and just get away with it, then we become like Stalin, we become mad, we become like Hitler or crazy people like Idi Amin. You know, we run amok like fallen demons. And so Numa Pompilius knew that, no, you've got to have some religion, guys, to just keep, you know, so that people want to do the right thing, so that they know that law is not just about force. The mistake the Spartans made, of course, is that they had too much force. And the way they ran their city-state. So I'm much more with Numa. He was also a lover of women, a lover of beauty. He had a muse that taught him. And he was a very wise man, Numa Pompilius. And dear old Plutarch knows all this. So he has, you know, in like manner, Numa spoke of a certain goddess or mountain nymph that was in love with him and met him in secret, and professed that he entertained familiar conversation with the Muses, to whose teaching he ascribed the greatest part of his revelations. And amongst them, above all, he recommended to the veneration of the Romans one in particular, whom he named Tacita, the Silent, which he did perhaps in imitation and honour of the Pythagorean silence. You know, I mean, it's gripping stuff, actually, if you're into philosophy and mysticism and mysteries. So that's, you know, and you can see Plutarch's mind working why he was writing the treatise that he did. And the miracle is this has come down to us. It was copied and recopied. It was in the libraries of Rome. It was in the libraries of Greece. It was in Alexandria. And the Christians didn't burn it all. You know, the monks knew that this was a sacred and important window on the history of Greece and Rome. So they copied it in their monasteries, and the Benedictine monks in the monasteries of Europe here were great scholars, lovers of learning, as was St. Benedict himself. So they lovingly wrote it out in Latin, and we have these old medieval manuscripts which have come down, you know, and then it was reprinted when printing was invented, and so we have Plutarch, thank God. But the the Delphic thing is the thing I'm most interested in, what he has to say about how Delphi was run and so on. So I'm researching that at the moment. And in the midst of that, I was doing some research, being an inquisitive kind of chap. And I was looking at, well, who's done work on Plutarch? Which classical scholars have really gone big time into Plutarch? And I have one of my favourite books of all time by a man called John Edwin Sandys, Sandys, was a history of classical scholarship, and it's the most extraordinary, detailed work. This man was a Cambridge academic, and he did a whole study of the history of classical scholarship in all of Europe. And really it's like to die for source text to go to. He's dead now. He was one of the great liberal thinkers. He was a friend of Gladstone, and it was printed by the Cambridge University Press in 1908. He was a fellow of St John's College, and he was in fact public orator at the University of Cambridge, so a great man. Now he reveals that one of the experts on Plutarch back in the day, and he's looking particularly here at German scholarship in the 19th century, was a man called Jacob Bernays. Now Jacob Bernays is an extraordinary intellectual, and I've been reading about him. I just want to share just an example of what real scholarship's about, right, in my view. He was the son of a Jewish rabbi. He lived from 1824 to 1881. And I think Freud may have married into his family. I haven't had time to research that, but I think that Freud might have married into the descendants of this rabbi, Jacob Bernays. He was born and bred at Hamburg, studied in Bonn, and spent 13 years at Breslau as a classical professor in a Jewish seminary, actually, so that's quite interesting. And then as a teacher at the university. He returned to Bonn University and became librarian, and finally extraordinary professor for the last 15 years of his life. He died in 81, so just kind of around the time Brahms was doing his thing. He got the doctorate degree by doing a work on Heraclitus in 1848, who was one of his great heroes. And he worked on Cicero, and he worked on trying to find Aristotle's lost discussion of the effects of tragedy. And I was part of an online Zoom conference of American classical professors looking into the question of catharsis and purification. Bernays said it was more like purgation than purification, and he felt there was a lost work on tragedy by Aristotle. He tried to find it. He came to England. He was a friend of Bunsen, who was then the Prussian ambassador to the court of St James. And Bunsen was a great intellectual in his own right, friend of Queen Victoria, private, personal friend, obviously, a friend of Florence Nightingale, who he convinced to become a nurse and told her to go and study how it was done in Germany. That gave her ideas for advanced nursing practices, which she then applied in the Crimea, and the rest is history. She founded the British nursing profession, inspired by Bunsen. And Bunsen himself was a great scholar who wrote about the impact of Egyptian theology on the birth of Christianity and later thought. He was an unbelievably learned man, so I'm not at all surprised that he was friends with Bernays, who was also friends, Bunsen, with Max Muller, who was the professor at Oxford for comparative philology, but he was studying all world religions and editing the sacred books of the East. And so he also found a work by Theophrastus, who succeeded Plato in the Academy, on piety, which is an incredibly important work. He found fragments. It doesn't exist. It's lost. But he was trying to revive it. And then he was doing unbelievably detailed work, including on Plutarch. But then he decided to sort of go off at a slight tangent, he discovered an earlier scholar called Scaliger, who was French originally, and he devoted several years of his life, many years of his life, to producing like a complete works of Scaliger and a life story and all that. So, well, who was this Scaliger? Why do that, you know? Why is that so important? So, I just want to share who he was, because this is a name that you know, is kind of lost. It doesn't trip off the tongue very easily. He was born in 1540 and died in 1609. So during that time, everyone was very confused about religion in Europe here. Should you be a good Catholic? Should you be a good Protestant? You know, like, what's the truth? He was born in France, and as a young man, he went to school in Bordeaux, and was very precocious, very clever young man. Bordeaux is a great city, by the way, absolutely beautiful, not too far from here. And then in 1559 he went to Paris to study, and he learned, by then he knew Greek and Latin, and he taught himself Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac and Persian, and the principal modern languages like English, German, Italian and so on. I mean, what? He's only like, 19 at the time. Then he converted to Protestantism in 1562. After his reading, his intense study, he decided, look, these Protestants are probably right when they say that it should be down to your reason to figure out what is absolute truth, you know, not what the Pope says. And then he set out on travels. He went to French and German universities, and to Italy, and to Rome, studying its antiquities. Unfortunately, in 1572, then there was a massacre of the Protestants here in France because of some totally crazy politics. And he then fled to Geneva, which was a haven with Calvin there, where he taught at an academy, and ended up in Holland teaching at the University of Leiden from 1593 onwards. And he remained there till his death in 1609. Now, Leiden is one of the great universities of Europe, and it was a haven for free thinking. It still is. It has Brill, the great publisher, which is publishing all the wonderful Gnostic texts. People like Giles Quispel and Nina van der Meer and all these great Dutch scholars, you know, they all use Leiden as a centre for scholarship. Now, what Scaliger did is he wrote this amazing book in 1583 called the Opus de Emendatione Tempore, the work on amending time, which was a study of all previous calendars. Now, think back to Numa Pompilius founding the Roman calendar. We still use it today, although it's been tweaked. What Scaliger was trying to say is, how do we know, comparatively, the histories of different nations, like the Romans, the Greeks, the Jews, the Babylonians, the Egyptians? What are the criteria for working out the calendrical intertwinings? This is something that Bede, one of the greatest scholars of the Anglo-Saxons, also struggled with. And it was Bede that introduced the BC AD system into English intellectual life, and to some extent in Europe as a whole. Although it was a monk, Dionysius Exiguus, who'd invented the system, it was Bede who popularised it. And bless him. Anyway, Scaliger was studying all that. He was looking at how time was computed by various civilizations in the past. He tried to correct their errors, and for the first time placed chronology on a solidly scientific basis. He reconstructed the chronicle by Eusebius, a great Christian historian, and he put it into a chronological sequence. And he basically revolutionized the way we think about chronology. He also, in his spare time, founded numismatics as the scientific study of coins, because they can obviously help a great deal with the study of chronology, because coins tend to be stamped with the date and the king or queen's reign, and then you can figure out, roughly, but if you have a big enough collection of coins, you can work out, like rearranging the kind of chronology of comparative kingdoms. Well, hey, dear old Joseph Scaliger, what an amazing intellectual he was back in the day. So no wonder Jacob Bernays then went to study him. Now, the reason I'm sharing is just because of my excitement of finding these people. I mean, I often feel that scholarship it's underappreciated. People like this guy Bernays or Scaliger, I mean, they spend their lives in university libraries. They spend their lives poring over these ancient manuscripts, trying to work out truth. And at the end of the day, 3 people say, well done, if you're lucky. But it's still important, and I think we now, in the current age, should give thanks, doff our caps to these earlier scholars who come before us. What I've been trying to do as a scholar now, in this day and age, is to say, okay, Scaliger, okay, Bernays, look up from your classical studies and let's refound the Delphic Games together. Scholarship's one thing, but then let's actually celebrate the arts. Let's have a place somewhere on the world, Delphi, where we can revive the ancient love of wisdom, and we can invite, the great thinkers and artists and poets. The skills of rhetoric are also celebrated in Delphi, so we can invite the great. This guy was public orator at Cambridge. Let the current public orator at Cambridge come along and do his 20-minute slot, and let the one from Bonn University or the one from Istanbul University or Washington. Let's turn it into a game, like a friendly competition, and then the winner gets the prize that year, every 4 years. So that's what we're saying. Let the scholars come and get involved in this. And I'm open to suggestions how we do it, and you can join my Zoom chats about this, where we're discussing these things. I think it's exciting, and that's the symbol as the 6 interlocking circles representing different arts. Ecology is one of them, the ecological arts, gardening, design, architecture, plus all the others. And in this day of COP26, which is just starting today, I think it's the first day or tomorrow, then we have to be mindful that we have a duty here on this planet to help look after it and pass it on to future generations, in as beautiful a condition as when we inherited it, our generation. Okay, so I want to just move on now and say the next little thing that I've got planned, which is very exciting. And this is about the tarot. As you know, I'm working on a tarot of the gods, and I'm really enjoying it. It's really detailed, intensive work, looking each day at a different god. And yesterday, I did the great architect of the universe, who is the god of Freemasons, really. Although there are different, in Christianity, the grand architect of the universe was the phrase in use in, the architectural motif was used in the Bible, in the Jewish faith. God is the artificer who creates heaven and earth, and he measures it out, and he acts like an architect. And it's in the mouth of Jesus. He often talks about building metaphors. He was a tekton, which means not just a carpenter, but a builder and an architect, someone that can build buildings. And so his famous metaphor, build your faith, your hearing on solid rock, where it can't be blown down, not on sand where it can be blown down. He's using building metaphors quite a lot. He uses it in the temple images. He says, You are a holy building, each one of us with our bodies and minds. You know, we are a holy building housing the Holy Spirit. And it entered into St. Paul's language. He uses this idea of we're living stones in the temple of God. And it emerges in St. Peter's writing as well, where the same ideas. Each Christian is like a stone in a big edifice, the church or the kingdom of God that is being built here on earth. It entered the language of St. Thomas, who was himself also known as an architect builder, who went to India and built, you know, a palace for the king made of faith, which is a bit like my Universal Peace Tower project that I'm working on with some Indian friends. So building is, and architecture is an ancient thing. Now, in the 17th century in Britain, after the unification of Scotland and England, there was a decision to put aside all the old religious wars, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, you know, it shouldn't matter. We're all brothers and sisters, you know, under the sun. And so we should be working together for common welfare and well-being of humanity. And Francis Bacon had this idea, I think, inspired by his studies and others, that let's have a sort of universal Freemasonic thing. He set it up at Canterbury Tower with support from the Scots. William Shaw, who was the master architect of King James, came down. I think Elizabeth supported the idea. John Dee was one of the inspirers. This idea of a sort of a society of savants. And I think they used little rituals and ceremonies. I think Shakespeare was involved as well. I mean, the early history of Freemasons is very interesting. And there were Scottish, you know, precedents as well. And then when the crowns came together and formed the United Kingdom, then the lodges really took off. And this idea that you should be a universal devotee of the great architect of the universe, it doesn't matter your religion, then spread. And French lodges were set up in the early 1700s. In Bordeaux, actually, was one of the first. Montesquieu became a member, one of the great intellectuals of France. And Chevalier Ramsay, a great Scottish Jacobite who became a Catholic and a great savant, he ended up at Saint-Germain with the king in exile, James II, who'd had to leave his tormented kingdom. I mean, unfortunately, William had got the backing of lots of financial bigwigs who pushed military capitalism into Britain and forced out faith. They trashed the Irish at the Battle of the Boyne. They kind of cheated by having mercenaries come from abroad. And they got rid of this idea that a polity is supposed to be about faith and spirituality and trust and loyalty and all that. All went out the window. No, it's about money, buying power, privilege, status. And that's the Tory party that we see. It's a shocking system we've now got. And the Queen wrote to me and says, I can do nothing about this because my hands are tied. About Brexit, that is, because she now regards herself as just a rubber stamp on whatever the political party that's ruling the Commons does. So there's no sense of the monarch speaks for the conscience of the nation. The monarch speaks, God forbid, for the voice of the heavens or the divine prophetic intelligence. No, that's all gone, you know. But James still kept it. The old guard of Christian monarchy still kept that idea that the king is actually answerable to God. I mean, Charles I made a great error when he went on about the divine right of kings. That lost him his head. If I'd have been advising him, I would have said, no, Charles, you got the wording wrong. You should talk about the divine duty of kings. It's not the divine right of kings. It's the divine duty of kings to speak up for the well-being of all the land. It was a terrible, terrible error of elocution. But he wasn't very good as a public speaker. He stuttered and everything. But he was a great artist, a lover of arts. He would have loved the Delphic Games idea. Yes. Where am I? Gosh, I'm getting so excited sharing all these things. Yes, okay, I'm with the great architect of the universe, the grand architect of the universe. And what I'm trying to say here is that idea of Freemasonry grew out of the horrors of the Civil War, grew out of the horrors of conflict, the wars of the 30 Years' War in Europe. And it was intellectuals saying, no, we're going to devote our lives to learning and scholarship and science, not to like stabbing each other in the back. People like Leibniz, Descartes, these were the new intellectuals who took a let's go beyond the battlefield and let's advance knowledge properly. Let's do it methodically, scientifically, as Bacon had said. And they were largely the Freemasons. So the Royal Society has had huge overlaps with Freemasonry. Many great scientists have been members of the Royal Society and also Freemasons. It's in a sense the same project. Building the Temple of Solomon, as they call it, is building the House of Wisdom for humanity. Many people who were active in France, they were inspired by Chevalier Ramsay, who gave a great lecture on an oration on the role of Freemasonry. And they then went on and founded the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, which had many of the initiates of the 18th century, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, many great economists. The founder of economics, Kennedy, was a member. Jeremy Bentham, a great educator and legal thinker in Britain. Stroganov, Golitsyn from Russia, people from Portugal, Spain. You know, they all became members of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which my Professor Nicholas Hans, called the UNESCO of the 18th century. So anyway, I've been doing this, and that's why I'm, excited about this image of God as the great architect of the universe. It is quite a good image. And it builds on from Ahura Mazda that I was just doing. Because in a sense, Ahura Mazda is the mediator between heaven and earth, all the gods and humanity. Well, in a sense, that's the God of the Freemasons too. It's like Ahura Mazda. So you can join whether you're Jewish or Christian or Islamic or Buddhist or Hindu, and or Sikh or Druid or whatever. There've been people from all faiths who've been Freemasons. And, it's fun. I never joined a lodge because I don't want to be accused of giving away secrets. I love giving away secrets. It's my duty as a public professor. So if a lodge will have me and I don't have to, shut up, I think it's important that we give away the mysteries to people so that they understand. Otherwise, Freemasonry gets a bad name. My friend John Hamill, who's librarian at the Grand Lodge in London, kind of takes the same view. They set up a museum there, which members of the public can go to. The same in Paris at the Grand Orient. There's a wonderful museum. But there's so much hatred of Freemasonry, particularly in parts of the world that haven't really got the intellectual history that I've been sharing. And it's a dark thing, it's secret societies and all that. Well, it's not at all. On the contrary, it's a place of enlightenment. Yes, of course, there are dark people that sometimes become Freemasons, but, any wise master of the lodge would weed them out and not let them proceed. Anyway, so that's the card for the Tower of the Gods project. Talking of intellectuals, the other thing I want to report on this week is the World Intellectual Forum. We just met yesterday, in fact, the 30th of the month. And we had a really interesting conference. We had speakers from many different countries, actually. And I think we had a speaker from Afghanistan who was joining us from Afghanistan. Very moving to hear his personal testimony about what's going on in Afghanistan.